Let's talk about drums. So in the last two videos, I have worked extensively with this teac M30. It's a beautiful analog mixer, and today I actually want to do the same thing. Now, we ran some bass through it, and we ran some guitars, electric and acoustic through it, and you can check that out in the last two videos, like I said. But today I would like to run some drums. A lot of you have been asking about my drum process, and this is going to be the first time I've ever tried running it through this unit, but I'm pretty confident that it's going to be pretty awesome. I love the EQ on it, like I said, and the thing that I really like about these old school mixers is they have a lot of breakup when you drive it, and so you get some really cool saturation. What I'd like to do is kind of go for a lo-fi experimental drum sound and see what we can get from it. And the goal is going to be to try and do everything, or as much as I can, in the box with this mixer, and then save as little as possible for the computer. So we're gonna go ahead and hook this thing up. Like I said, I'm gonna run my mics through it. I'll show you guys the process, and then we'll take a listen to how it sounds and see what we can get. Okay, so we're gonna go through the first mics here. Now, the snare, I'm doing something a little bit interesting. So I've got my typical top snare, and that's pointed pretty much directly just a few inches off the batter side of the snare. But I've also got a second snare mic, and these are both SM57s, but I've got a second snare mic that is pointed slightly above the shell. It's almost like a side snare miking, but it's not quite. And the reason it's also kind of further away is another thing. The reason I like this is just with my setup. I particularly love the way the kick comes through. It's almost like a front kick mic, which is, you don't really see that too often, but I love the way that it picks up the batter head of the kick. It also just picks up a little bit more ambience from the whole kit itself. But I've got both of these mics running into independent channels on the M30, so channels 1 and 2, and then those are being summed to one input on my interface. So that's just how I've done it. I've got my EQ and everything set for those two mics independently, but they are being summed to one channel, and then I can process that as such in the computer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually play the independent mics as well as them together so that you can hear kind of what I've got going on for the snare. Keep in mind, again, I really push the input of these two mics so that it's really hot, and we're getting a lot of clipping from the M30. And so it's going to sound a little bit weird, but in context of the drum mix, I think it sounds really cool. So it's a very distorted snare, but again, in the context of the mix, I think it sounds really cool. So let's take a listen. All right, so for the kick drum, I'm doing a very similar thing as I did with the snare. I have pretty much, I think it's 60 hertz. I've got that boosted all the way pretty much so that it clips really hard. And it's a very like weird, low end just thump from the kick itself. But when I combine that with the overhead, it actually sounds really cool. Very lo-fi, but really cool. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna play the kick by itself, but then we'll blend it with the overhead and see how that sounds. Okay, so for the overhead, I'm using Warm Audio's WA47 Junior. That will be my main mono overhead mic. And I unfortunately can't run that through the M30 because it doesn't have phantom power, so all my condenser mics will be going directly into the interface. But I've done a pretty good job at emulating what I think it would sound like had it been running through this. And down the road, I'm open to try and get some dedicated phantom power boxes and trying to run some condenser mics through it. But for now, I'm using Artorias 1073 plugin, and I'm just driving the input signal quite a bit, getting a lot of breakup to sort of match the vibe of the kick and the snare. And I think it sounds pretty cool, so I'll show you what that sounds like, and then we'll take a look at my stereo pair. Okay, so for my stereo pair of condenser mics, I'm using Rode M5s. Now these are very, very cheap pencil condenser mics, which means that we can actually hang them from the ceiling. Now typically your condenser mics, you're gonna get stands and they tend to be kind of expensive. And so when I was starting out, I actually would just hang them from the ceiling because you can get a very similar sound, if not maybe a more desirable sound. And you don't actually have to buy expensive stands because these are such light mics that you can just hang them on the cable and they work just fine. So that's what I've actually got going on with this particular mix. Nothing fancy, and it's very, very low in the mix. Remember, this is just a very subtle stereo widening of the mix. I'm not trying to go crazy or overboard. It's mostly a mono drum mix. This just adds a little bit of width. As far as the processing, I'm doing a very similar thing as the way I did with the WA-47 Junior. A lot of breakup happening through here. And I'm also taking a lot of the low end out, and I'm taking a lot of the top end out because these tend to be kind of bright mics, these pencil condensers. Typically cheaper mics tend to sound a little bit brighter, I've found. So I'm just kind of attenuating some of that top end to make it feel a little bit more at home with this particular mix. So we'll take a listen to that and see how that sounds. Okay, so I want to talk about a little trick that I like to do. Now this, for my last mic, it is a condenser mic, and it's sitting in a room over to the left of me when I'm on the kit. Now you don't actually see this room, but it's a small little tiled closet. And the reason I throw a mic in there, it's pretty much always live, is because it picks up a more ambient part of the kit. And I can process it and send it through reverb or just do a lot of cool things. And so like I said, I'm not actually using it for this mix. But what I did do is I have it going through an amp sim to get some cool reverb on it. It's a really weird way to process a drum mic, but it actually does sound pretty cool. And I tend to use this trick a lot for my drum mixes. It helps to enable me to get a bigger drum sound if I need it. And so like if you've ever set up your drums and you have a spare mic, I highly recommend throwing that mic maybe in an adjacent room or just somewhere far away so that you can process it. It's a lot more fun when you add reverb to it, and just sounds a little bit more natural than just trying to throw reverb on a drum bus or something like that. So I'm gonna show you what that sounds like, and then we'll listen to the full kit. Okay, so as far as the processing on the computer side is concerned, I'm not actually doing a ton. Now, the main thing is with the snare channel. Remember, I'm bussing those two snare mics together. And so on the computer side, normally when you're miking your snare, you get a lot of bleed just because the hi-hat's right there. And so there's a few ways to minimize that. Obviously, you can play lighter on the cymbals. You can try and space the snare from the hi-hat, or maybe try and face the mic opposite of the hi-hat. But you're still gonna get a lot of bleed. Typically, it's just kind of inevitable. And especially with my secondary snare mic, which is literally facing the hi-hat, it's kind of hard to avoid it. And so what I've done is I've used a little bit of expansion, which instead of compressing the dynamic range, we're gonna expand it. So that way the snare sticks more out and then the hi-hats kind of drop down. So just a little bit of expansion, a little bit of EQ. And because I'm separating that snare just a little bit more, I can actually run it through some distortion even further to just get that really lo-fi kind of sound. So that's what I'm actually doing for this mix in particular. I think it sounds really good. As far as the other mics are concerned, I'm just doing a little bit of EQ here and there, maybe a little bit of compression if need be, in particular with the overheads. And as far as the drum bus is concerned, I'm actually not doing a ton. It's just a little bit of like very subtle EQ and just a little bit of compression. But for the most part, everything is happening from the M30. So let's take a listen to some of the full kit and just see kind of what we got going on. Like I said at the beginning of the video, this is my very first time running anything drum related through the M30. And I have to say, I really did like it. I thought it sounded cool. I like the workflow of it, the way that it colors the sound, but I definitely want to hear your guys' opinion on it, what you thought it sounded like, if you liked it or not. And just kind of let me know down in the comments what you guys thought and what you guys want to see in the future. This is just one video on drums, and I definitely plan to make a lot more. Until then, I will see you guys on the next one, and I do appreciate everyone who stuck around.